Heute geht es in unserem Podcast um das Saxophon, das ja ein Wanderer ist zwischen den Welten, vor allem zwischen dem Jazz und der sogenannten ernsten Musik. Wofür sich das Saxophon und sein Klang am besten eignen, das ist hier die Frage. Und die kommt diesmal auf Englisch.
Hello, dear Lucerne Festival. As someone who loves both classical music and jazz, I have a question about the saxophone, which is an instrument that's very closely identified with the history of jazz, but also occasionally used in classical music. So I would be very interested to hear if you think that the sound of the saxophone is actually better suited to classical music or to jazz, and why?
The answer to this question will be given by Valentine Michaud, the French saxophonist who is the winner of the Crédit Suisse Young Artist Award in 2020. Nice to see you, Valentine.
Nice to see you.
Valentine, does the saxophone and its sound better fit in classical music or in the jazz? What do you think?
It's a difficult question because I don't think there is an answer. Actually, the saxophone is really famous for jazz music. Like in the broad audience, it's more famous for its contribution to jazz. But initially, it's a classical instrument. Well, it was invented for military bands, for the army. Actually, it was invented in Belgium. So it was made for this kind of music, and then the jazz took the saxophone and made like history with it, and it kind of went back and forth the US and Europe, and it also settled in classical music. So for me, both are really fine. I chose the classical path, but of course it sounds amazing in jazz. I mean, yeah.
Is there a difference in terms of technique when playing a jazz piece or a composition from a classical composer?
Well, yes, there is a lot of differences actually. Well, first of all, just to speak about the piece, like in jazz, you improvise.
Yes,
it's not
true.
the case when you have a written piece of classical music. So this is, of course, a huge difference. It's not like saxophone or not saxophone, but it makes a huge difference. For the saxophone, it's also very different because usually, like the mouthpiece you use, the reeds you use, even the saxophones you use are not the same. Mm-hmm. So it changes a lot your sound, and also your embouchure is not exactly the same. In classical, it's quite tight. In jazz, it's more loose, and you also like support a lot in jazz. It's also due to with which instruments you play. I mean, if you play with a whole band with the drums and so on, of course you need certain amount of power that you don't necessarily need in chamber music for classical music. So there are a lot of details that change actually. Yeah. But technically, like, fingers are the same.
And the mouse.
Yeah, the mouth is kind of the same. It's not exactly but the same, but yeah.
Let us try to do a short experiment. Could you play a short phrase first in the jazz idiom and later in the classical style manner? Would it be possible?
First with jazz. Okay. Yeah, let's try that. I can try to switch a bit because my mouthpiece is like really, really classical. Well, I'm not a jazz expert at all, so it won't be like
doesn't matter
the jazz sound of your life, because actually I don't even have a real jazz mouthpiece. You could have, for example, these mouthpieces are like ebonite. I don't know
Ebenholz.
Yeah.
Ebony.
No,
yeah.
Ebony.
No.
Ebonite.
Yeah. So,
but you use like a metal mouthpiece.
I don't know the French word.
More powerful sound and much more metallic harmonics, much more sharp sound. So this is still like a soft sound.
I see.
Yeah, so let's try this. Let's try to make a sound first. would be like
This would be jazz.
Sharp sound, yes.
With blue notes.
Yes, with blending notes, with also some air in the sound. When you play classical, you try to reach a sound that is much more round in a way, so more like a oo and less like ah.
Yeah.
But also like the classical sound is somehow more format, like you reach for the most purity in the sound that you can. In jazz, it's much more personal. Each jazz player has his sound. When you listen to Coltrane, you're like, this is Coltrane, this is Charlie Parker, this is Stan Getz. You can really recognize the sound because it's really so personal. In classical music, it's a bit harder to recognize the sound. Of course, it's possible, but it's much more in a shape of sound that you try to reach, like the most pure harmonics, the most round sound. So let's try if I can switch so easily. Not sure. Yeah, and of course you will be much more like strict in terms of attacks and articulations. Much sharper. Also the vibrato changes. There are a lot of changes.
What sort of piece has this been, your example?
I chose this extract because it's actually a piece right in the middle of these two styles. It's the Hot Sonnet by Erwin Schulhoff. It's a German composer.
Classical composer,
but who wrote this Hot Sonnet because he got inspired from these jazz players that he heard in bars and so on. So it's written for classical musicians or these saxophonists that were also usually clarinetists that were playing in these army bands. But it's kind of using jazz idioms within this more classical writing. So it's interesting for us saxophone players because we really need to choose how we want to play this. And there is no like rule for it.
When studying the saxophone, did you concentrate only on the classical music or did you learn jazz techniques as well?
I started actually with jazz when I was a kid, also world music, but I did some jazz education until I was like 16, something like this, until actually I entered the classical bachelor. And then I thought maybe I can keep going with both. But actually no, because it's really a different aesthetics, it's really different embouchure, and the classical music just took me so much time that I didn't practice jazz since.
There are about 10 different types of saxophones existing, from the sopranino to the contrabass. Do you play them all?
I didn't play them all yet. I didn't even see them all yet because the contrabass is like extremely rare. I never saw one like in flesh, in metal. But I tried them all the rest until the bass. I usually play more alto, soprano, tenor in German music also. Sometimes the baritone, but baritone is really heavy, so I'm a bit
not the smallest and the biggest ones.
But I do have a soprano saxophone here actually. So this is an alto. So this is like the standard where usually you start with alto when you start the saxophone. Actually, I started even with this one. So, and this is the soprano. So the soprano is straight like this. Looks like a clarinet, but it's not. It is a saxophone. It was also popular in jazz. Like there is a very famous soprano saxophone player called Sidney Bechet, like in the early jazz. And of course, it was used also by Coltrane, by many many players. So it's the mouthpiece, of course, is different. It's much smaller, but the keys are the same. So once you know the notes on one saxophone, you basically know the notes on every saxophone. It's just not the same tone. So this one is in B flat.
Yeah.
Alto is in E flat. Tenor is in B flat. Baritone is in E flat. It's like switching like this. So this, of course, goes much higher.
Interesting. It sounds more like a clarinet.
It does sound a bit like a clarinet, yeah. It's a bit in between many instruments. It's in between clarinet, flute, oboe.
Yeah.
Depends also on your reed. Depends of how you play it. It has many colors actually, so it's a very fascinating instrument. I like it a lot.
Yeah. In your recitals, you are using different saxophones. When you appear at our festival, Life is Life, for instance, soprano and alto saxophone, as far as I know. Is it difficult for you to change in one and the same recital from one to the other instrument? I mean, a violinist, for instance, never plays the violin and the double bass in one and the same concert.
Yes.
How do you manage to do this?
It's always a challenge. It's always a risk because the reed dries, so you never know if it's going to be perfectly okay when you switch. So it's always a bit of stress.
Yeah.
Or it's like you said. It's also more or less difficult depending to which saxophone do you switch. Like if you do like soprano, baritone is kind of challenging
because the space of the keys is wider.
It's okay, but the most challenging is the embouchure, because you really have to loosen or sharpen depending if you go big or low. And honestly, the biggest risk is the reed, because if the reed is dry and you don't have time to warm it up before because you are on stage and you just need to change the saxophone, there is always a risk, but this is the fun of it. And yeah, I do it because like this you can also play more different repertoire, and it's also a broader palette of sounds. So I like to use different, but yeah, there is a price for it.
And which of the saxophones is your personal favorite?
That's a tough question. I don't know. I wouldn't know how to choose between the alto and the soprano. These are definitely my two favorites. Yeah.
Which type of saxophone will you present during your recital on August 20 at our festival?
So that on the 20th, I will play two saxophones, actually my two favorites. I will play transcriptions, mainly on, just transcriptions on the soprano saxophone. So actually a flute sonata by Prokofiev and oboe sonata by Poulenc. So this is also to show how the soprano can adapt to different type of repertoire for different instruments. Of course, it will not sound like a flute or like a oboe. It will sound like a soprano saxophone, but still it's a different approach of sound also. And I will play alto for two original works for saxophone, which are quite different. One from the 20th century by Denisov, a sonata, and one by a Swiss young composer, so which is like 2017, the piece. And I will also play a short transcription on the alto, but from cello. So the alto saxophone is really close from the cello. It's warm, it's round, it's the same ambitus, the same range. So it happens that we play repertoire also from the cello.
Are most of the original compositions written for the alto saxophone?
Are multiple compositions?
Are most of the original compositions written
from the early ages of the saxophone? Yes. Yeah, all the famous classical repertoire. So the saxophone was invented in 1846. So this is really recent for an instrument. It's 150 years. So yeah, all the big classical composers that we have, Debussy, Schmidt, Ravel, and so on. They mostly wrote for Glazunov also. They wrote for alto mainly, sometimes soprano in the orchestra, tenor in the orchestra, sometimes for Prokofiev, but the solo works were mainly for the alto saxophone. Now is equal, now is everything. Yeah.
And you will play Prokofiev in your own transcription and Poulenc?
Yeah, well, it is actually, yeah, it is transcriptions that we decided to arrange. So these two pieces are really close to the saxophone range. So it doesn't need that much of a transcription, actually. It needs more of a transposition. You still have to make a couple of choices for the flute sonata, but for the oboe, it's really like you can just play what's written and it's working perfectly. So that's quite easy, yeah.
Valentine, we are really looking forward to this recital, and we recommend to all fans of the saxophone, don't miss this concert with Valentine Michaud. Valentine, thank you so much for this conversation and good luck for your future and for the festival.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to this recital very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Wenn auch Sie noch etwas wissen wollen und spezielle Fragen zur Musik oder zum Musikleben haben, dann nur los. Schicken Sie uns einfach ein Video im Querformat an info@lucernefestival.ch und wir kümmern uns dann um die Antwort. Vielen Dank fürs Zuschauen und bis zur nächsten Folge.